The alarm on the wall of Fort Hays showed 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Captain Sarah Mitchell walked into the command center. She had been assigned to the military base for 6 months now, and in that time, she had learned that arriving early to her shift made no difference to how people treated her. They still ignored her opinions in meetings. They still questioned her authority. They still acted like she didn't belong. Sarah was a woman in a man's world, and not just any woman. She was compact and strong, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and shoulders that carried the weight of decisions without flinching. Her hair was always pulled back tight, military regulation perfect. Her uniform was pressed with knife-sharp creases, but none of that seemed to matter to the men around her. "Mitchell," Colonel Garrison called out as she settled into her station. He didn't look up from his paperwork. "I need you to handle the cafeteria logistics today. Jenkins called in sick." Sarah felt the familiar heat in her chest, the one she had learned to control but never quite extinguish. She was a trained interrogator, a specialist in her field. She had studied languages, psychology, cultural dynamics, and tactical communication for 15 years. She had a master's degree. She had commendations for her work, and today she was being asked to manage the cafeteria. "Colonel, I'm scheduled for the intelligence briefing with the new prisoner transfer," she said quietly. Her voice never showed anger. That was one of her gifts. She could feel rage like fire inside her and speak like she was discussing the weather. Garrison finally looked up. He was a man in his 60s, thick around the middle, with the kind of confidence that came from never having anyone tell him no. "The briefing can wait. We need someone organized down there, and frankly, you've got nothing better to do right now." Nothing better to do? Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She had learned long ago that fighting back in these moments only made things worse. It gave them ammunition. It confirmed whatever small prejudices they already held, that she was difficult, that she was too sensitive, that she couldn't take a joke or handle the real work. She stood up, grabbed her jacket, and headed for the cafeteria. Behind her, she heard the men chuckling. Someone made a comment about female officers and their natural place in the kitchen. The laughter followed her down the hallway like a physical thing, pushing at her back. The cafeteria was chaos. The lunch rush had ended an hour ago, but the dinner preparations hadn't begun. There were plates piled in the sink, the grill hadn't been cleaned properly, and the supplies for the evening meal were scattered on the counter in no particular order. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She organized the supplies by meal type, alphabetized the inventory, cleaned and sanitized every surface, and actually spoke to the workers about what they were doing well and what needed improvement. She did it the way she did everything, completely, thoroughly, and with a mind toward making systems better. By 5 o'clock, the cafeteria was transformed. The dinner shift workers looked around in genuine surprise. One of them, an older man named Frank who had been working on the base for 20 years, caught her eye and nodded with respect. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sarah was walking back to the command center when she saw the truck pull through the gates. It was a military transport, unmarked and heavily secured. Even from a distance, she knew what it was. The prisoner transfer she had been supposed to conduct the briefing for had arrived early. Her heart sank a little. She would have missed this. The initial documentation, the first assessment, the chance to establish the dynamic before the interrogation began. These early moments told you everything you needed to know about someone. She picked up her pace and headed back to the command center. Maybe Garrison would let her catch up with the intake process at least. Maybe she could still salvage something from this day. But when she arrived, she found that Garrison had already assigned the intake interrogation to Captain Marcus Webb. Webb was competent enough, but he lacked what Sarah had, the ability to read people, to understand the layers of their fear and bravado and pain. He was efficient but crude. He got information, but he missed the context. "You're back," Garrison said, not looking up. "Good. We'll need the cafeteria ready for dinner service by 6. The new arrivals will want to eat after processing." Sarah stood very still. She was being dismissed from the intelligence side of her job entirely. She was being relegated to food service and logistics while Webb sat with the prisoner, building the rapport that would matter in the real work ahead. "Colonel," she said, and her voice was still calm, "I should be conducting that intake. I have the training and clearance. I understand the cultural context. And I appreciate you sharing your thoughts," Garrison interrupted. He said it in a tone that suggested her thoughts had no actual value. "But Webb has this. You stick with what you've been assigned. You did good work in the cafeteria today, Mitchell. Turns out you've got a real knack for that kind of thing." She wanted to throw something. She wanted to scream. She wanted to make them understand how much potential they were wasting, how much damage their dismissal was doing to her career, how insulting it was to be treated like she was less than just because she was a woman. Instead, she nodded and walked back to the cafeteria to begin preparing dinner for the evening shift. The men and women who would come through that line would have no idea who was organizing their food, what she was capable of, or what she had been denied today. They would eat and move on, and the machines of the military would continue to grind forward, indifferent to injustice as long as everything ran on schedule. Sarah stood in the quiet cafeteria before the rush began and made a decision. She was going to prove them wrong. She didn't know how yet, but she would find a way. She was going to show Colonel Garrison and every man like him that you didn't dismiss Captain Sarah Mitchell without consequences. She just didn't know yet that the consequences would come in the form of a captured Japanese soldier and a simple hamburger that would change everything. The dinner rush came and went. Sarah worked smoothly, her hands efficient as she plated food and managed the flow of soldiers. She smiled when appropriate, spoke when necessary, and thought about everything happening in the interrogation room down the hall. She knew Marcus Webb's techniques. They were aggressive, designed to establish dominance and confusion. They worked fine on soldiers who had been trained to resist them, but they were crude. They missed nuance. They didn't build the kind of trust that led to genuine intelligence sharing versus grudging tactical information. Around 8 o'clock, after the main rush had cleared, Frank approached her. The older cafeteria worker looked thoughtful. "You know what I've been thinking," he said. "I've been working here for 20 years and I've never seen this kitchen organized like this. You've got a real gift for it, you know that." Sarah almost laughed. A gift for organizing a kitchen. That's what 20 years of training and sacrifice had amounted to. But Frank wasn't finished. "And I've also been here long enough to know when someone's being treated unfair. That colonel, he's an idiot. Anyone with eyes can see you're worth 10 of half the people in this building." It was kindness, and Sarah appreciated it, but kindness couldn't change the system. Kindness couldn't get her the assignment she deserved. Kindness was just kindness, and the world ran on power and opportunity, not on how good you were at what you did. "Thank you, Frank," she said, and she meant it. "That means something." "You'll get your shot," he said. "People like you always do just takes time." Sarah wasn't so sure. She had been waiting for her shot for 6 months, and every day it seemed to move further away. But she didn't say that to Frank. She just finished closing the kitchen and headed back to her quarters. That night, she lay in her small room and thought about the prisoner. She thought about what Webb might be missing. She thought about the intelligence that could be gathered if someone with her skills was in that room instead of someone following a playbook of aggression and intimidation. She thought about fairness and how it was a luxury that didn't actually exist in the military. It was all about who had the authority and who didn't, and right now she didn't have any. She didn't know that tomorrow morning everything would start to change. She didn't know that a single conversation would crack open the entire structure of her dismissal. She didn't know that she would get her shot, but it would come in a way she could never have predicted. All she knew was that she was angry, and that anger was fuel. And tomorrow she would wake up and do the job she had been given, and she would do it better than anyone else could have. Because that was who she was, and no amount of dismissal could change that. Outside, the base was quiet. In the compound where the prisoners were being held, Marcus Webb was wrapping up his interrogation. He had gotten the basics: name, rank, unit, the standard information, but he hadn't gotten what Sarah would have gotten. He hadn't understood that the man sitting across from him was terrified and hungry and deeply homesick. He hadn't seen the opportunity in that. And Sarah, sleeping in her small room, had no idea that her life was about to intersect with that prisoner's in a way that would change both of them forever. Tomorrow would be the day everything shifted. Tomorrow would be the day that Captain Sarah Mitchell stopped waiting for permission and started demanding justice. And it would all start with something so simple, so human, so unexpectedly powerful that it would shake the entire foundation of what everyone at Fort Hays thought they knew. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, there was only the quiet base, the sleeping soldiers, and one woman whose fire had not yet found its purpose. Sarah was sitting in the break room with her coffee at 6 in the morning when Captain Webb found her. He looked exhausted, which meant the interrogation had gone late into the night. There was also something else on his face, frustration, mixed with something that might have been doubt. "Mitchell," he said, dropping into the chair across from her, "I need to ask you something." Sarah raised her eyebrows. Webb never asked her for anything. They barely spoke outside of the chain of command communications. "The prisoner we brought in yesterday," Webb continued. "I can't get him to talk. I mean, I got the basic information, but anything beyond that, he's locked up tight. It's unusual. Normally, they crack faster than this." Sarah took a long sip of her coffee. She was surprised that Webb was asking, but she was also careful not to show it. She knew what this was. This was a man who had suddenly realized he was in over his head and wanted help from someone he had previously dismissed. "What's your approach been?" she asked carefully. "Standard intimidation. Establish dominance, make him understand his situation, apply pressure. But it's not working. He's just shutting down more. It's like the more I push, the less he gives." Sarah had suspected this before she even saw Webb in the interrogation room. She knew his style. It was the style of someone who thought fear was the only language worth speaking, and she knew that for some prisoners, especially those from certain cultural backgrounds, that approach could backfire completely. Some people responded to fear by closing themselves off entirely. They retreated into themselves rather than opening up. "He needs to feel safe," Sarah said. "Or at least safer than he feels now. Your approach probably made him feel like anything he says will be used against him, which, fair point, it will be. But you need him to understand that cooperation might actually benefit him, that you're not just going to punish him for whatever he admits to." Webb leaned back, considering this. "So what do you suggest?" Sarah almost said no. She almost told him that she wasn't his personal consultant and that he should figure this out himself. But she was too smart for that. She understood that this was an opportunity. If she helped Webb, she would become indispensable to the interrogation process. She would get access to the prisoner. She would get to do what she was actually trained to do. "Let me sit in on the next session," she said. "I won't take over, but I can help you adjust your approach, see if we can get better results." "Garrison will never approve that," Webb said. "He's got you locked into logistics." "Then don't tell him," Sarah said. It was bold, but it was also not technically against regulations. She could be in the observation room. She could offer tactical advice. It wasn't the same as being the primary interrogator, but it was more than she had now. Webb considered this for a long moment, then he nodded. "All right, tonight we'll try it your way." When Webb left, Sarah sat for a long time with her coffee, thinking about what she had just done. She was bending the rules. She was going around Garrison's head, at least indirectly. If this went wrong, it could damage her career significantly. Military careers were built on obedience and chain of command, and she had just stepped outside of both. But she also knew something that Webb didn't, something that every person who worked in intelligence eventually learned. The rules existed for a reason, but they also existed to protect mediocrity. People followed them because it was safe, because it meant you could never be blamed if something went wrong. You had just been following orders. Sarah had never been interested in being safe. She had always been interested in being right. The day passed in the usual way. She managed the cafeteria, she dealt with supply orders, she listened to the men around her make jokes about her being demoted to kitchen duty. By noon, she had stopped hearing them. They were just noise. Beneath the noise, something was building, something was shifting. At 7 o'clock that evening, she headed to the observation room. Webb was already there, along with the prisoner. His name was Takeshi Nakamura. He was 24 years old, from Osaka, and according to the file, he had been captured during a Pacific campaign. His English was minimal but functional. Sarah watched through the one-way glass as Webb started the session. She could see immediately what the problem had been. Webb's body language was aggressive. He was taking up space, invading the prisoner's personal space, using his size as a weapon. Nakamura was folded in on himself, his hands clenched, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Sarah picked up the radio that connected to Webb's earpiece. "Let him breathe," she said quietly. "Back up, give him some space." Webb hesitated, but he did it. He stepped back and sat down a few feet from the table instead of right next to Nakamura. The change was immediate. Nakamura's shoulders dropped slightly, his hands unclenched. "Now ask him something that isn't about military information," Sarah continued. "Ask him something human." Webb looked confused, but he tried it. "Where are you from?" he asked. Nakamura looked up, surprised. "Osaka," he said in accented English. "Small city close to mountains." "Nice there?" Webb asked, following Sarah's guidance. Very nice, Nakamura said, and for the first time something like emotion crossed his face. It was brief, but it was there. Homesickness. Loss. For the next hour, Sarah guided Webb through a complete change in approach. They asked about Nakamura's family, his life before the war, his favorite foods, his hobbies. None of it was directly related to military intelligence, but all of it served a purpose. It was building trust. It was establishing Nakamura as a human being rather than just a source of information. By the end of the session, Nakamura was talking more openly. He wasn't giving up tactical information yet, but he was present in a way he hadn't been before. He was engaging instead of shutting down. When the session ended, Sarah waited in the observation room for Webb. He came in looking both frustrated and enlightened. "He's not going to give us the kind of information we need," Webb said. "Not tonight anyway." "Not tonight, no," Sarah agreed. "But he will. Trust is the foundation. Once he trusts you, or at least trusts that you're not going to destroy him, he'll open up. It'll take time, but it'll work better than force ever would." Webb nodded slowly. "Mitchell, I've got to ask you something. Why didn't you ever tell anyone you had skills like this? This kind of approach, this is exactly what we need. Why are you working in the cafeteria?" Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "I didn't get asked to do this kind of work, Captain. I got assigned to logistics because that's what happens when you're a woman in a command structure run by people like Colonel Garrison. You prove yourself competent at something, and suddenly that's all you're allowed to do." "That's not right," Webb said. "No," Sarah agreed. "It's not, but that's how it is." Webb left, and Sarah sat alone in the observation room, looking at the empty chair where Nakamura had been sitting. She had helped break through to him, had started to establish the rapport that would eventually lead to real intelligence sharing. But she had done it in the dark, through an earpiece, like a ghost in the machine. It wasn't what she wanted, but it was more than she had yesterday. And tomorrow, or the day after that, maybe she could push a little further. Maybe she could edge her way into having more authority, more visibility, more of a voice in how this interrogation was actually conducted. She didn't know that the real turning point was still coming. She didn't know that it would arrive in the form of something completely unexpected, something that would force Garrison's hand and make him finally see what she was actually capable of. That turning point would come the next morning, and it would start with something so simple that nobody would have expected it to matter at all. The next morning, Sarah was in the cafeteria doing inventory when Frank approached her with a strange request. "There's a prisoner asking for something specific," he said. "I don't usually relay requests like this, but this one seems important. He's asking for a hamburger." Sarah looked up from her clipboard. "A hamburger?" "Yeah, I know, strange request. But apparently Webb was asking him about his experiences, and somehow it came up that he's never had an American hamburger. He came from a military family, never been to the States before he was captured. So he's asking if he can try one." Sarah's first instinct was to dismiss this. Prisoner requests weren't usually honored, especially not food requests that went beyond basic nutritional needs. But something in the way Frank presented it made her pause. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I think it matters," Frank said simply. "I think it matters that someone who was fighting against us is asking to try something from here. I think it means something, and I think you're the person who would understand that." Sarah considered this. She could go to Garrison, tell him about the request, and let him make the decision. But she knew what Garrison would do. He would deny it out of principle because that's what men like Garrison did. They denied things on principle because it established hierarchy and control. She could also just make the hamburger. Nobody had said she couldn't make a hamburger for a prisoner. It wasn't against the rules, it wasn't unauthorized beyond the standard protocols. She could make it as part of her regular cafeteria duties. She could have Frank deliver it. It wasn't breaking any rules, not really. "What's his name?" Sarah asked. "Takeshi Nakamura." Of course it was. The prisoner she had been helping Webb interrogate. The one she had finally broken through to by treating him like a human being instead of an adversary. "All right," Sarah said. "I'll make him a hamburger, the best one I can make." She spent the next 30 minutes doing something she rarely had time for in her military position. She cooked with care and attention. She grilled the patty to exactly the right temperature, toasted the bun, assembled fresh lettuce and tomato, added a good spread of mayo and mustard, and wrapped it carefully in paper. She even cut it in half the way nice restaurants did. When it was ready, she handed it to Frank. "Tell him it's on the house," she said. "Tell him it's because he asked politely and because everyone deserves to experience something good, even if it's just a hamburger." Frank took the package with a smile and left. Sarah didn't expect anything to come of this. It was just a burger. It would be consumed, forgotten, and the war would continue on around them exactly as it had before. She was completely unprepared for what happened next. That evening, after her shift ended, she was called to Colonel Garrison's office. She was sure she was in trouble. She was sure that someone had reported the hamburger, that she had overstepped, that she was about to be disciplined for taking unauthorized action. But when she arrived at Garrison's office, what she found was very different. Garrison was sitting at his desk, and standing in front of the desk was Captain Webb, and standing next to Webb was Takeshi Nakamura. Sarah's instinct was to come to attention, but the scene was so unusual that she hesitated for just a moment. "Mitchell," Garrison said, and his tone was strange. It wasn't angry. It was something else, something almost like respect, or at least the beginning of respect. "Mr. Nakamura requested to speak with me about something, and he mentioned that you should be here." Sarah looked at Nakamura. His English was halting, but his voice was clear and determined. "Captain Sarah," he said, addressing her directly, "that hamburger, it was the most. It was a perfect thing. You made it, yes. Webb says you made it. I wanted to thank you." Sarah felt her face flush. She wasn't used to being thanked. She wasn't used to being acknowledged at all. "You're welcome," she said carefully. "Where I am from," Nakamura continued, "we have samurai code, Bushido. It is about honor and respect and treating others as you wish to be treated. That hamburger, it was not just food, it was respect. You showed me respect when you had no obligation. When I was your enemy, you treated me like a person." He paused, and Sarah could see the emotion on his face. "I decided," he said, "that if such respect was given to me, I should return it, so I will talk. I will tell you what you ask, not because I am forced, because someone showed me that humanity still exists even in war." Sarah felt something catch in her throat. This was not what she had expected. She had made a burger because it seemed like the human thing to do, but she had never expected it to create this kind of moment. Garrison cleared his throat. "This is quite extraordinary," he said. "Mr. Nakamura has agreed to share significant intelligence with us, starting immediately. Captain Webb believes that your approach has been instrumental in establishing the level of trust necessary for this cooperation." There was a pause. "Captain Mitchell," Garrison continued, and she heard something in his voice that she had never heard before. Uncertainty. "It seems I may have underestimated your capabilities. Webb informs me that you have been providing tactical guidance on the interrogation process." Sarah felt Webb's eyes on her, wondering if she was going to admit what they had done. "With respect, sir," Sarah said carefully, "Captain Webb and I have been working collaboratively on the most effective approach to the interrogation. We've been adapting our strategy based on the subject's responses, which is standard practice." It was a diplomatic answer. It was true but vague. It didn't directly admit to anything unauthorized, but it also didn't lie. And Garrison, faced with the fact that his dismissal of Sarah had resulted in him missing significant intelligence, and that Webb had been relying on her expertise all along, seemed to understand that he was going to back down. "I see," he said. "Well, clearly, your expertise is more valuable than we have been utilizing. I would like to propose a reassignment. Effective immediately, you will be co-leading the interrogation process with Captain Webb. Your primary role will be tactical guidance and cultural analysis. You will also continue to oversee cafeteria logistics, as those systems have improved significantly under your management." Sarah understood what this was. It was a compromise. It was Garrison trying to save face while also accommodating the fact that she was clearly necessary to the operation. She was being promoted, but not fully. She was being given more authority, but not complete authority. But it was also an opening. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. "I believe that's an excellent use of our resources." "Dismissed," Garrison said, and there was something grudging in his voice, but also something else. Something that might have been the beginning of respect. As Sarah left his office, Nakamura caught her eye. He bowed slightly, a gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement. It was a small thing, but it meant something. It meant that her choice to treat him with humanity had created a consequence that rippled outward. That night, she sat in her quarters and thought about what had happened. She thought about how a single hamburger had broken open the entire structure of her dismissal. She thought about how Garrison's assumption, that she was suitable only for logistics, had been shattered by the simple fact that she had refused to stay in the box he had put her in. She was still not a full interrogation lead. She was still being asked to maintain the cafeteria logistics, but she had cracked the system. She had proven that the dismissal had been wrong, and she had done it without direct confrontation or anger or any of the things that would have marked her as difficult. She had done it through excellence and humanity. But she didn't know yet that there was more to come. She didn't know that this was just the beginning of a much larger revelation. She didn't know that Nakamura's cooperation would lead to intelligence that would shake the entire base, and that her role in that intelligence gathering would make her impossible to dismiss. That revelation was still coming, and it would be far more significant than any hamburger, no matter how perfectly made. For the next 3 weeks, Sarah worked with Nakamura in a way that was completely different from anything Webb had been able to achieve. She didn't interview him like a soldier extracting information from an enemy. She talked with him like someone genuinely interested in understanding his perspective. She learned about his family, his education, his philosophy. She learned about the structure of his unit, his commanding officers, the logistics of their supply lines. She learned it all not by demanding it, but by creating an environment where he felt safe to share. The intelligence that came from these sessions was significant. It outlined a supply network that military strategists could exploit. It detailed the demoralization within certain units. It provided information about command structures and decision-making processes that would be valuable to American military operations. But more than that, it provided something else. It provided an understanding of the enemy as human beings, not just as faceless combatants. And in that understanding, the possibility of predicting behavior, of understanding motivation, of ultimately negotiating better strategies for conflict resolution. Colonel Garrison noticed. More importantly, General Morrison, who oversaw the entire base and the intelligence operations there, noticed. He called Sarah into his office on a Tuesday morning, and she walked in not knowing what to expect. Morrison was an older man, gray-haired and serious, but with the kind of intelligence in his eyes that suggested he actually paid attention to things like competence and contribution, regardless of the person displaying them. "Captain Mitchell," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "I've been reviewing the intelligence reports coming from the Nakamura interrogations. The work is exceptional. More than that, it's thorough in a way that most interrogation reports are not. It doesn't just provide tactical data, it provides context, it provides understanding." "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "I understand that Colonel Garrison has been underutilizing your skills," Morrison continued, and there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew the answer to this before he asked. "That you were primarily assigned to logistics until recently." Sarah was careful here. She could throw Garrison under the bus, but that would damage relationships and mark her as someone who didn't respect the chain of command. She needed to be strategic. "Colonel Garrison made the assignments he thought were best for the base operations at the time," Sarah said. "The cafeteria logistics did improve under my management, and the interrogation work began as a collaborative effort with Captain Webb that evolved based on the results we were getting." Morrison nodded slowly, and she could see a small smile at the corner of his mouth. He understood exactly what she was doing, and he respected it. "I want to expand this," he said. "We're getting new prisoner transfers coming in over the next month. I want you to establish a full interrogation protocol based on what you've learned from Nakamura. Create a manual, train other interrogators, make this approach systematic rather than individual. Additionally," he continued, "I want to address the cafeteria situation. You've made significant improvements there, but you shouldn't be splitting your time. I'm going to hire a civilian manager for that operation. You'll be fully transitioned to intelligence work. As of next week, you'll have the rank of major, and you'll oversee all interrogation operations at this base." Sarah heard the words, but she had to process them for a moment before they actually registered. She was being promoted. She was being given full authority over the interrogation department. She was being pulled out of logistics completely. Garrison's dismissal of her, his assumption that she was suited only for kitchen management, was being completely overturned. "Yes, sir," she said. "I appreciate the opportunity. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Morrison said. Because you haven't let anyone down so far despite being given every reason to underperform. You did your job well even when it was the job you didn't want. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. When Sarah left Morrison's office, she felt different, lighter and also heavier at the same time. She had been waiting for this moment, pushing toward it, and now that it had arrived, it was almost anticlimactic. It was simply a correction of an injustice. It was simply a system finally recognizing what should have been obvious from the beginning. But before she could fully process this new development, something else happened. That afternoon, she was called to an emergency meeting with Garrison and Webb and Morrison. There was a tension in the room that hadn't been there before. "We've had a problem," Garrison said without preamble. "A serious one. Some of the intelligence provided by Nakamura has been corroborated by other intelligence sources, and it's revealed something significant." Morrison took over. "There is a systematic network of corruption within this base's command structure. Supplies intended for the troops are being diverted and sold on the black market. Money is being misallocated, and more critically, this diversion is compromising military readiness. We've found evidence of falsified reports being submitted to cover it up." Sarah felt the implications of this settling over the room like a weight. "Nakamura provided the information?" she asked. "He did," Morrison said, "and he did it voluntarily, though he didn't fully understand the scope of what he was revealing. He was talking about the corruption he observed in his own forces, and in the process, he described practices that mirror what's happening here." "Who's involved?" Sarah asked. There was a silence. Garrison wouldn't meet her eye. "Senior leadership," Morrison said. "It goes higher than this base." Sarah understood immediately. Garrison was involved. Maybe not as a primary player, but he was benefiting from it, which was the same thing. His willingness to dismiss her, to keep her away from real intelligence work, might have been partly about gender, but it might also have been about keeping her away from information that would have revealed the corruption. "What happens now?" she asked. "An investigation," Morrison said. "Full military investigation, probably involving federal authorities. This is going to be messy, and it's going to reflect poorly on the entire base. But it's necessary. Military integrity depends on our officers being accountable." He paused. "Captain Mitchell, Major Mitchell, I should say, you're going to be questioned about your interactions with Nakamura. The defense is going to argue that his intelligence is unreliable because he was given special treatment. I want you to document everything. Every interaction, every decision you made, every reason for your approach. We need to make the case that your methods resulted in reliable intelligence because they were based on sound principles, not because they were compromising." Sarah nodded. She understood what he was asking her to do. She was going to be the shield that protected Nakamura's credibility, which meant protecting the entire investigation. "I'll have everything documented by tomorrow," she said. "Good," Morrison said. "And Mitchell, what you did here, the integrity you maintained, the way you handled this, that matters. That's what being an officer is actually about." When the meeting ended, Sarah sat at her desk in her new office. The office that had previously belonged to a captain, but now belonged to a major, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. She thought about the hamburger. She thought about how a simple act of treating someone with respect had created a cascade of consequences that had exposed massive corruption. She thought about how Garrison had tried to suppress her, and how that suppression might have protected the very corruption that was now being revealed. She thought about justice, and how sometimes it arrived in ways you didn't expect. Sometimes it arrived through a captured enemy who valued honor enough to speak truth. Sometimes it arrived because you treated someone with kindness when you had every right not to. The investigation was going to be long and complicated. There were going to be people who wanted to discredit her, who wanted to make her seem like she had been manipulated or had manipulated Nakamura in turn. There was going to be conflict and accusation, and all the ugly machinery of a military institution trying to protect itself while also purging itself of corruption. But Sarah was ready for that. She had spent so long pushing against a system that didn't want to see her, and now the system had no choice but to acknowledge her. The question was what she would do with that acknowledgement. The investigation began in earnest the following week. Federal agents arrived at the base with subpoena power and the authority to interview anyone they wanted, in any capacity. The atmosphere shifted overnight from a functioning military installation to something that felt more like a crime scene. Sarah spent her days preparing documentation and her nights making sure everything was perfect. She had audio recordings of her sessions with Nakamura. She had detailed notes on her interrogation approach. She had the psychological rationale for every decision she had made. She was building a fortress of evidence that would prove her methods were sound and that the intelligence Nakamura had provided was reliable. But it wasn't easy. The first challenge came when the defense team, lawyers hired by Garrison and his co-conspirators, began questioning whether Sarah had actually been extracting genuine intelligence or whether she had been implanting suggestions, leading questions, false information. "You gave the prisoner special treatment," the lead defense attorney, a sharp woman named Catherine Hayes, said in an interview. "You gave him food he requested. You asked him about his personal life instead of his military service. These aren't standard interrogation techniques. They're methods of bonding, of creating artificial intimacy. How do we know you weren't simply leading him to tell you what you wanted to hear?" Sarah had prepared for this. She had thought about how to frame her responses so that they would be legally and professionally sound. "Hamburger was prepared in the normal course of my duties as cafeteria manager," Sarah said. "It was provided because refusing a reasonable request would have damaged the rapport we were trying to establish. The personal questions were asked because psychological research shows that prisoners are more likely to provide accurate information when they feel treated with dignity rather than hostility. My approach wasn't designed to manipulate. It was designed to maximize the reliability of the intelligence." "But you were also providing guidance to Captain Webb on his interrogation techniques," Hayes continued. "You were essentially reshaping his entire approach. How is that not manipulation?" "It's adaptation based on observed outcomes," Sarah said calmly. "The initial approach wasn't working. The prisoner was shutting down. By adjusting the strategy, we got better results. That's not manipulation. That's competent interrogation work. And you had no prior authorization to do this. You were simply acting on your own initiative to change the interrogation protocol." Sarah paused here. This was the moment where she had to decide whether to protect herself or to be truthful. She chose truth. "Colonel Garrison had assigned me to logistics," she said. "Captain Webb asked for my advice on how to improve his approach. I provided that advice. It wasn't authorized in the sense of going through formal channels, but it wasn't unauthorized in any meaningful sense. I was functioning as a consultant to the interrogation process. No rules were broken." Hayes made a note, looking somewhat disappointed that she wasn't going to get Sarah to admit to something more dramatic. But the real challenge came a week later. Garrison requested a meeting with Sarah. It was unusual and she almost declined, but she decided to accept it. She wanted to see what he would do. He was waiting in his office, but he didn't look like a man in power anymore. He looked diminished, older, tired. The investigation was wearing on him. "I want you to reconsider your position," he said without preamble. "You have the ability to make this go away." "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Sarah said, though she understood perfectly. "The intelligence from Nakamura," Garrison said. "You know how to frame it. You could argue that it was too tainted by your methods to be reliable. You could say that his statements were influenced by the special treatment you gave him. You could cast doubt on the entire investigation." Sarah felt something cold move through her chest. He was asking her to lie. He was asking her to use the credibility that she had built to protect him. "No," she said simply. "Mitchell, I'm offering you something here," Garrison said, and there was an edge of desperation in his voice. "I'm offering you the chance to maintain good relationships with senior leadership. If this investigation goes the way it's going, I'm going to go down. But before I do, I can make sure that you're protected. I can make sure your career is protected." "By lying," Sarah said. "By being smart about this," Garrison said. "By understanding that loyalty matters more than morality. By understanding that in the military, you take care of your own." Sarah stood up. She felt calm in a way that surprised her. "I'm not your own, Colonel," she said. "I was never your own. You dismissed me because I was a woman and because I was a threat to whatever you had going on here. I did my job despite that dismissal. I provided honest intelligence. I'm not going to undermine that now, and I'm not going to lie to protect you. If you go down, it's because you deserve to." She left his office and reported the conversation to the federal investigators that afternoon. It was one more piece of evidence, one more sign of how the corruption had gone all the way up the chain of command. But her conversation with Garrison also shifted something. It made her realize that the investigation wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about whether the military institution valued integrity or valued loyalty to the hierarchy, and that mattered. It took another 3 weeks for the investigation to conclude. When it did, the findings were extensive and damaging. Garrison and 4 other officers were charged with conspiracy, theft of government property, and falsifying military records. Federal prosecutors announced they would be seeking prison time. The corruption went higher than Garrison. He was connected to a network of officers spanning multiple bases. Sarah's role in the investigation was recognized publicly. Major Sarah Mitchell, the interrogator who had developed the innovative techniques that led to the intelligence that exposed the corruption. Major Sarah Mitchell, who had maintained professional integrity throughout the process. General Morrison personally commended her at a formal ceremony in front of the entire base. But more than that, he made her the commander of a new intelligence training program designed to implement her interrogation methods across all military facilities. She had gone from being dismissed as a kitchen manager to being one of the most respected intelligence officers in the military establishment. But Sarah wasn't interested in celebration. She was interested in seeing Nakamura. After the investigation concluded, Sarah requested permission to speak with Nakamura privately. The request was unusual, but was granted given her status and role in the case. She met with him in a secure room at the prisoner holding facility. Nakamura stood when she entered, showing the respect and deference he had learned from his culture. But Sarah asked him to sit, and she sat across from him, not in a commanding position, but in conversation position. "Thank you for what you did," she said. "You didn't have to tell the truth about what you observed. You could have remained silent or you could have given false information. But you chose to speak honestly. I want you to understand that was brave." "You showed me respect first," Nakamura said in his accented English. "You made the hamburger, you listened, so I listened back. It is simple exchange. You gave honor, I gave honor. This is Bushido." "The war is going to end soon," Sarah said. "Everyone knows it. When it does, the prisoners will be returned to Japan. I want you to know that your actions here, your honesty, will be documented. Japan will know what you did. I'll make sure of that." Nakamura nodded slowly. "This is good," he said. "But I will have question for you. Why did you do it? Why did you make me the hamburger and listen to my stories? You could have been different. Your commanding officer wanted different." Sarah thought about this for a long moment. She thought about the rage she had felt at being dismissed. She thought about how easy it would have been to just accept the role she had been given, to do what was asked and no more. "Because I'm a soldier, and I understand what it means to be treated as if you don't matter," she said. "I understand what it means to be underestimated and dismissed, and I understand that the only way to prove you matter is to matter anyway, to do excellent work even when no one is watching, to treat people with dignity even when you have power over them, to remember that we're all human underneath the uniforms." She paused. "And because it was the right thing to do," she added, "that matters more than anything else." When the conversation ended, Nakamura bowed again, deeply and with genuine respect. Sarah left the facility and walked across the base in the late afternoon light. Around her, soldiers were going about their duties, unaware that the place where they worked had been fundamentally changed by one woman's decision to treat a prisoner with respect, and by one prisoner's decision to honor that respect by speaking truth. That night, Sarah sat in her office and reviewed the file on Garrison's sentencing. He had been convicted on 3 counts and was facing 7 years in a federal prison. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. The network of corruption he was part of had been dismantled. But Sarah didn't feel satisfaction in that. She felt something more complicated. She felt the weight of what she had done. She had exposed a man, and while he had deserved to be exposed, while the system had been corrupt, it was still significant. It still meant something. She thought about the hamburger again. She thought about how something so small had created consequences so large. There was a knock on her door. It was Webb. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for not throwing me under the bus during the investigation. You could have, you could have said I was a bad interrogator and that you had to come in and fix my mistakes." "You weren't a bad interrogator," Sarah said. "You were just inexperienced with that specific approach. You learned fast, and more importantly, you were willing to listen and to adapt. That's what matters." "I'm being transferred," Webb said. A new base, new assignment, but before I go, I wanted to say that working with you changed how I think about this work. It made me understand that real intelligence isn't about domination. It's about understanding. I'm going to carry that with me. After Webb left, Sarah sat alone in her office, the commander of a department she had been denied just months earlier. She thought about what General Morrison had said about integrity. She thought about what Nakamura had said about honor. She thought about the women who would come after her, who would push against a system that tried to keep them small, and who would find strength in knowing that at least one person had fought back and won. The phone on her desk rang. It was her mother calling from home. Sarah's father had passed away 5 years earlier, but her mother still called every Sunday. Today, though, it was a different day. "I saw something on the news," her mother said, "about some corruption at your base being exposed. It sounded like you were involved. Are you all right?" "I'm more than all right," Sarah said, and she realized as she said it that it was true. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, Mom, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing." "I always knew you would be," her mother said. "Even when people doubted you, I always knew." After the call ended, Sarah sat for a long time in the quiet office. Tomorrow, she would begin training new interrogators in her methods. Tomorrow, she would continue the work of transforming how the military approached intelligence gathering. Tomorrow, the machine would continue grinding forward. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. She had been dismissed, and she had refused to be diminished. She had been underestimated, and she had exceeded every expectation. She had treated an enemy prisoner with respect, and in doing so, she had exposed truth that had needed exposing. The hamburger had been a revelation, but not the kind that anyone could have predicted. It hadn't converted an enemy into a friend. It had simply reminded him that humanity was worth preserving and that honor was worth defending. And in doing so, it had given a woman the platform to stand and be seen. The military would never be perfect. There would always be men like Garrison, always be systems that underestimated women, always be injustices that needed fighting. But Sarah Mitchell had proven something important. She had proven that integrity was a weapon more powerful than any gun, and that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could create the largest revolution. Outside her window, the base settled into night. Somewhere Nakamura was in his cell, knowing that soon he would go home, and when he did, he would carry with him the memory of an American officer who had treated him with respect. He would tell his family about the hamburger that tasted like civilization, like possibility, like the knowledge that war was conducted by humans, not machines. And Sarah Mitchell, Major Sarah Mitchell, commander of intelligence operations, would go home to her quarters and sleep soundly, knowing that she had fought the good fight and won, not through aggression or manipulation, but through something far more dangerous. Through being undeniably, unquestionably excellent. The story could have ended differently. Garrison could have been more clever, could have hidden his corruption better. Sarah could have been content in logistics, could have accepted the dismissal and moved on. Nakamura could have remained silent, could have used his cooperation only to gain small comforts and advantages. But each of them had chosen differently, and in those choices, a small corner of a broken world had been repaired. It wasn't everything. It wasn't fixing the war itself, or eliminating all injustice, or creating a perfect system. But it was something. It was one officer proving her worth, one prisoner choosing honor, and one simple hamburger that meant far more than anyone could have expected. And sometimes, that's how change happens. Not in great dramatic gestures, but in small moments of decency that ripple outward in ways nobody can predict. The sun rose over Fort Hays the next morning, and another day began. But the base was different now, transformed not just by an investigation, but by the courage of a woman who refused to be kept small, and by a man who understood that dignity was more powerful than victory. The revelation of the hamburger was complete, and Sarah Mitchell, having earned her place in the light, would continue standing there, not demanding recognition, but making it impossible to ignore.